Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and today we're going to be sewing together our yukata pattern. I previously shared instructions on how to create this pattern to fit your doll, and just in case you missed it, I'll link to that video in the description. I'm using the raw pattern with no seam allowances added, so I've cut extra fabric around the edges to make that seam allowance. As I explained in the previous video, there are a few ways this pattern can be put together depending on how accurate or how easy to sew you want it to be. A traditional yukata or kimono would have a seam down the center back, but as you can see, I've cut my back piece on a center fold so there's no seam, which saves me a little sewing. If you do want the center seam, then you'd need to include the seam allowance on the side where the center fold is for me, and then you would sew the two pieces together down the middle to create a solid back piece. Likewise, traditionally, the front center and front pieces would be two separate pieces and sewn together to create a seam where you can see the line on my pattern piece. The only thing you really gain from cutting additional pieces is realism, which isn't important to me personally on this garment, but might be important to some, so your preference. Again, I've opted for simplicity, so I've cut these out as a single large piece instead of two separate smaller ones, but if yours is two separate pieces, this is the seam you would sew next, giving yourself two complete front panel pieces. On particularly small dolls such as a USD or even smaller like a PukiPuki, cutting these out as one piece makes construction much easier. However, on big dolls you may prefer the extra detail of having more pieces. Either way, once you have your front and back pieces, we'll move on by putting them together at the shoulder with right sides together. The sloped side of the front is where the collar goes, so make sure that's to the inside. Then we'll sew the shoulders with a straight stitch, back stitching at the beginning and end of the shoulder seams. Unfortunately for me, this was when my camera battery decided to die, so we'll charge that up and move on. Once the shoulder seams are complete, finish the edges of the shoulder hems with a zigzag or overlock stitch. As always, while I'm working, I want to extend a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, who help provide the resources I need to keep making videos and tutorials like this. Thank you all so much for making these things possible. Clip your threads and then grab a sleeve. My pieces are a little wrinkled from sitting for a few days waiting for me to sew them together, but we'll iron them later. The first thing we do with the sleeves is finish the edge all the way around. I do this with a zigzag stitch, sewing around the entire sleeve piece, and then I grab the other sleeve and do the same thing. Next is the collar. You can cut this as one long strip and then you wouldn't need to do anything with it yet. But I prefer to cut mine in two pieces because it makes it easier to center later on. Sew the two collar pieces together to make one long strip with a seam right in the middle. The seam should be pressed open so it lays flat. At this point you should go ahead and iron this and all your other pieces while you're at it so that everything is nice and perfectly flat. Before we attach the sleeve to the body, we'll need to finish the sides of the body as well. Just one straight shot, finishing both the front and back on both sides with a zigzag or overlock stitch. I think I need to have more space behind my sewing machine next time. It sure bunches up back there. To attach the sleeves, the first thing you'll do is find the center. If you've cut yours with a curved outside corner on the sleeve like I have, then you'll do this on the squared side. But if both sides are squared, then it doesn't really matter which side you pick. Put the sleeve and the body with right sides together, and pin the center point of the sleeve to the shoulder seam where the front and back of the body are sewn together. Now traditionally, the inside edge of the sleeve here is open, so we're going to sew it that way. You'll only want to connect the top part of the sleeve. For my doll, which is 1/3 scale, I find a 3-inch seam is more than enough to connect the sleeve. I measure 1.5 inches out from that center pin and find the point where this sleeve seam should begin and end. I pin the other sleeve on the same way. You don't have to use pins to mark your beginning and end points. You could use pencils or ink to mark if you prefer, but either way you'll start sewing at the beginning mark, backstitch a bit to lock your stitches, then run to the end mark and backstitch again. This leaves space to keep the bottom of the armhole open. Next, we'll close the bottom and front edges of the sleeve. Remember that the underarm side stays open. So we'll sew across the bottom, around the curved outer corner, and up the front of the sleeve, making sure to leave an opening for the hand. I leave a 2-inch opening at the top of the sleeve to make sure I have plenty of space for my doll's hand to pass through. Since the edges of the sleeve are already finished, all we have to do is pin the edges closed and then sew them shut with a straight stitch, backstitching at the beginning and end. Sew both sleeves closed the same way. At this point, the side of the yukata can be closed, making sure to leave an opening at the bottom of the armhole. The size of the opening is up to you, but I find measuring down about 2 inches from where the sleeve is sewn on is a good size for SD dolls, and pretty close proportionally to how large the opening would be for humans too. The rest of the side can be pinned shut as usual. Once both sides are pinned, sew the side closed in either direction, either going from the arm opening down to the bottom hem, or up from the hem to the arm opening. As long as you backstitch at the beginning and end to keep the pieces from coming apart, it doesn't really matter which direction you go. Like with the sleeves, our edges are already finished. My thread broke at one point. That happens sometimes, no avoiding it. I cut the broken bit, rethread my machine, and get back to it. Anytime my thread breaks while sewing, I like to start sewing again by backing up 1/2 inch to 1 inch prior to where it broke before, just to make sure that seam is really solid. That finishes the sides, leaving the underarm open. Before we attach the collar, we'll want to finish the front opening, and also the bottom hem. Do this by using a zigzag or overlock stitch to finish the straight edges of the front opening. Not the sloped part or the neckline, just that straight front edge. Finish both fronts and go ahead and finish the bottom edge too. We'll finish the hem by folding the edge to the inside by about 1/4 inch, both on the front edges and along the bottom hem. This can be sewn all in one go, starting at the top of one side on the front, going down the front, turning to sew across the bottom, and then sewing back up the front on the other side. When it's time to attach the collar, you may find it easiest to first fold the collar in half lengthwise and press it, so that it is already the shape you want on the finished garment. Optionally, you can add some iron-on interfacing to one half of the inside of the collar like I have, to help it stand up really crisp and straight once it's all together. The collar and the body of the yukata should go together with right sides together. The seam in the center of the collar can be lined up against the center seam of the back if yours has one. Or you can just find the center point of the neckline, like I have, and pin it there. The ends of the collar should run well past the ends of the sloped front, which will give us room to finish the collar in a few minutes. The collar gets sewn onto the body of the yukata with a regular straight stitch. At some point during this process, my camera shifted on my tripod and I unfortunately didn't notice, but hopefully everything is still clear for these steps. After the collar is sewn, we will finish the ends by folding the collar wrong side out. We'll sew straight across the square end of the collar, from the edge of the front to the top edge of the collar, so that the collar remains square instead of being slanted, like it might be if we had followed that front edge. This is sewn with a normal straight stitch, and after it's sewn, you can cut off the excess fabric. Sew both ends of the collar this way. To complete the collar, fold the collar right side out and turn the raw inner edge to the inside by about 1/4 inch. This will envelop the raw edge where the collar is attached to the body and give a beautiful end result. Although I pinned my collar on the inside, I opt to sew it closed by sewing on the outside. That way I can ensure the seam on the exterior of the collar is perfectly straight. This does mean some awkward fishing under the fabric to remove pins from the bottom side, but it gives a really tidy end result, which I really prefer. You could also use a hidden stitch to sew the collar on the inside, which means there would be no visible seam at all. The last thing to do is finish the edges of the underarm opening and the sleeve cuffs. As you may remember, these edges were already zigzagged to prevent fraying. So now all we have to do is fold these edges to the inside by 1/4 inch or so, and then sew it closed. This is something you'd probably prefer to do by hand normally, as it can be extremely difficult to do on a machine. As you can see, there was not really a good way for me to get my camera in there because the space was so small, but I finished the underarm and then the wrist cuff of the sleeve in the same way. In doll scale, honestly, it's not even necessary to sew this in place. You could definitely just turn these edges to the inside and iron them, and they would stay. However, I personally enjoy the tidy finish you get by stitching them down. At this point, the yukata is now complete. All that's left to do is find a ribbon or fabric I like for the obi, which is something I'll be doing another day because I have to learn how to tie it first. If you make something with this tutorial and share it on Instagram, make sure you tag it with #LomiTutorials so that I'll have a chance to see. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye. I hate doing videos when I have a cold.